Hey there friends, welcome back to As a Man Thinketh on Yanasa TV. Today I wanted to talk about the bee situation. A lot of people have been very concerned about the honeybees, and it's true that the numbers dropped this year by 70%. There was a 70, I think the numbers were about 60%, but they assume it's going to be about a 70% hive loss over winter this year. And typically what we've seen over the past 20, 25 years or so is a 40 to 50% loss of bees. Before that though, it was more like 10 to 20%. And there's been a lot of speculation as to what could be happening. So I wanted to discuss some of those possibilities. Does anybody have the answers? No, there's a lot of different speculations. And I'll give you what I think might be happening in this video as well. So one of the biggest speculations is the amount of forage. And something that I have noticed when it comes to pollinators around here is that I've seen over the years a decrease in the number of some of our more native pollinators like butterflies. And that does have me a little bit concerned. The hillside to my back right there, that used to be significantly covered in milkweed every single year. And the milkweed went away on its own, which is highly unusual. Anybody who has milkweed in their pastures can tell you how unusual that is. Now, we don't spray or do anything like that in our pastures. We used to spray and the milkweed would just come back. But we stopped doing any of that years ago when we decided to be a little more holistic with our management practices, and those weeds went away. Now that could be from grazing, although cows and other grazing animals don't typically eat the milkweed, and they have plenty of other things to eat out there. We have a couple pastures. They're all next door right now. So I don't really know what has happened to those flowering plants, if there's something else in the air that could be impacting them. But just around our property in general, we do have lots of flowers, lots of things. We did lose one of our hives, but the reason for that hive was those little waxworm things. And I think what happened was I had taken out honey the wrong time of year. They weren't strong enough to make it through the winter. It weakened the hive, and then they were overcome by pests. Because typically, honeybees can fend off a lot of the pests that try and enter their hives. We haven't had that much problem with mites. The way I treat mites, though, is a little differently than the way other people treat mites. I plant mint around the base of our hives, and mites don't like the mint. But the bees love the mint, and so it kind of works as a natural way of handling things like mites. So, you know, there's been speculation of loss of honeybee forage. Part of that also has some speculation into climate, because when we've had milder winters and we go through these massive temperature swings going into the spring, you know, that does cause plants to bloom a little early. Sometimes it can wipe out, you know, an entire tree's buds. Not in the last 2 years, but 2 years ago, we had a very warm February, and our pear tree had bloomed out early, and what ended up happening was it lost all of its pears because then we hit a freeze and it killed everything on it. And that's something that you've seen throughout the United States in different areas, different years. It hasn't been happening as much around here the last 2 years. In fact, I'd say the last 2 winters have been consecutively getting longer and colder the last 2 years than the years prior to that, where it was consecutively getting warmer. So that could be a possibility, but I also think that is a variant, you know, that would have different impacts across our country. And believe it or not, the last couple of winters, there have been some pretty harsh winters out west. And so that wouldn't explain, you know, the increase in bee population drop-off over the past 20 years, from 10 to 20% up to 40, 50%. And I don't think it necessarily explains the 70% this year. forage could be a concern in some areas, but not widespread, okay? And that's what when I think about these things, I try and think, what could be impacting these widespread? I've heard 5G network could be doing it, and there's no doubt in my mind that the increased radio waves that we're putting into the air are having some sort of impact on bees, insects, plants. I mean, there's just no way that it couldn't have an impact. That's something that I don't know the extent to which that could happen, but it's just fascinating when you get into the rollout of 5G and you start looking into things like, COVID and bird flu and all these other things. What kind of impact is our need for technology actually having, and our need for communication actually having on the environment? There haven't been enough studies done on it, and I don't think that we're going to see a whole lot of studies done on it, because the problem is that there's too much money to be made from it. If people started thinking, oh well, we've got problems because of it, then well, corporations will end up losing money. Simple as that. So 5G, I think could be a factor. But again, if 5G was a factor, you would have seen an increase, a step up of bee population as 5G actually rolled out. And that brings me to weather manipulation, because there are lots of reports out there that talk about the pollution of aluminum in our soils, the pollution of aluminum in our waters, and it's not a secret, I don't think anymore, that chemtrails have been a thing. We've been spraying things in the air since World War II, okay? And so there could be a buildup from those types of activities that could suddenly be impacting the bees more. I'm not saying that that's not a possibility. That is certainly a possibility. But again, when I think about these things, I think about, the time frames that have occurred. Since the 90s, we've seen this increase of pollinator drop-off during the winters, specifically honeybees, which they're, a lot of people are like, well, they're not native to the United States, they're not our native pollinators, let them go. As I said at the beginning of this video, I've actually seen a decrease in native pollinators as far as butterflies where we are. I haven't necessarily seen a decrease in bumblebees. I almost feel like that's kind of a year-by-year thing. Sometimes there are more bumblebees, sometimes there are less bumblebees. But I definitely think that there has been a decrease in native pollinators. Honeybees are managed. People bring their hives back each year. I'm about to go split my hives, make up for the hive I lost, maybe get 2 more new hives out of the split. So you have people managing those bees and bringing them back. The honeybees themselves wouldn't survive out here in the wild. They'd be taken out by pests pretty quick, and diseases. There's an argument to be made from archaeological evidence that there was a time when there were a form of honeybee in North America that was native here, and guess what? They died off. When we look at these stats, it is interesting because we watch the honeybees so much to look at them and say, oh my gosh, we had a 70% die-off this year. If this trend continues, we're in big trouble, because they pollinate 75% of our agricultural foods that we grow. The other side of that is that the native pollinators have also been dying off, and there's nobody managing them. Nobody's going in there and purposefully rebuilding them over time. So there is, when it comes to food security, when you hear these numbers, there should be a concern amongst all of you of what happens when the honeybees are gone. And there should be a concern for all of you of what happens when our native pollinators are gone as well. I've also, we've also seen a massive drop off in birds, and that seems to be accelerating as well. But, like I said, with the chemtrails, again, I feel like you'd have to have this steady increase of the honeybees dropping off instead of just these sudden jumps. That doesn't quite explain, the sudden jump. Just scientifically speaking, there's not a correlation. It's like saying that, global warming and CO2 are directly correlated when they're not. If you look at the graphs, they're not. And so you have to find another explanation, in my perspective. That's how I work. If there's too many deviations, that might not be what the problem is. So I said that I would give my opinion of what I think is going on. And some of you may think I'm absolutely crazy for thinking this, but I think, even when looking at changes in our climate, changes around the world, some weird things we've seen, including auroras as far south as North Carolina just last year. I tend to look at a lot of different variables and weigh them against what I'm seeing. And something that I will say correlates with the increased pace of hive losses, the increased pace from 10 to 20% up to 50 to 40%, is the velocity at which the North Pole has been moving. In the 90s, that velocity increased dramatically. And as that velocity increases, there are a lot of animals that are very sensitive to changes in our magnetosphere and our magnetic energy. And we've seen this over the last several years. We've seen a complete migration of king crab in Alaska. We've seen changes in bird migration. I don't know if a lot of you have been paying attention to whales, but we've seen the random mass beaching of whales during this time frame, which a lot of people say is unexplainable. But all of these animals are very tuned into the magnetic energy of our planet. They use it for navigation. They use it for timing the seasons. They are very well aware of it. And as humans, there are a lot of people who walk around barefoot and stuff because they're trying to rebuild that connection themselves. I mean, almost every species on our planet depends on it, and we depend on 5G. It's kind of a weird thing. It's like we're an alien species or something. My point is that there was this increase in speed and velocity at which the North Pole started traveling. And unlike times when it just kind of meandered around, it started beelining it towards Russia in the 90s. And it was a very fast movement. And then it kind of slowed down a little bit in recent years. It's still moving much faster than it normally would, but it kind of, it went through this period of, moving really quick, and then it just kind of slowed down a little bit. Now, people who follow this stuff and are geniuses when it comes to magnetic poles and changes in our overall solar system, because all of this could be linked to solar forcings. They would tell you that that polar wander is most likely going to speed up. Now, the data that we normally get on that information is often delayed, okay? So we went through this period where it started shooting towards Russia, then it kind of slowed down a little bit. Still historically high. What if, and I don't have, like I said, I don't have the charts and stuff to back this up, but what if we saw an increase in the speed in which our pole is shifting again over the wintertime? What kind of impact would that have on our pollinators, on a lot of different species around our planet? It would make sense. And it's the only thing that I have found that has any correlation to an increase or a decrease in honeybee populations. And honeybee populations are managed so we can track that information. And going back into the 90s, when the poles started moving faster, that's when we started seeing this jump from 10 to 20% loss to 40 to 50% loss. I think what we're seeing is some sort of change again going on with our magnetosphere, our planet, the energy on our planet, and solar forcings. As I mentioned in a video the other day, I was talking about El Nino, La Nina, the Enso cycles, and how La Nina, for a very long period of time, was much less common than El Nino. We almost seem to constantly be going into an El Nino cycle, which is when the Pacific Ocean is warmer than usual. And it caused a lot of alarm for a lot of people because the Pacific Ocean was constantly warm, constantly causing an El Nino phase. And then we've recently, for the last several years, been in this phase where La Nina is the dominant pattern coming out of the Pacific, which is when the Pacific Ocean isn't warmer, but it's actually colder. So when that ocean cools off, and the only factor in anybody who is a meteorologist, climatologist, any of these people that study this stuff, the only thing that influences that the Enso cycle is actually the sun. And these things have, I mean, the sun and our magnetosphere have tremendous impacts on everything down to, the Atlantic Ocean oscillations, and those are starting to change and slow down. Now, the concern for me is that these things are happening fairly quickly, and you've seen what it does, what I think is happening to our pollinators and other species. Like I said, we've seen a drop in birds. We saw the big crab migration. We've seen whales beaching themselves in epic amounts. We've also seen turtles start to go migrating in different directions. There have been reports of predators acting differently around the world. All of these animals are tuned into these things. When you look at things on a global scale, what has actually changed so abruptly. Anthropogenic global warming is supposed to be this gradual thing that's been happening. It's not abrupt. These changes have been abrupt. The only thing that I can think that changes abruptly and has been changing abruptly, and again, there's a lot of research that you can do on this, and it's something I would pay attention to if I were you. Polar wander, our magnetosphere, and changes in the energy coming from the sun have all changed rather abruptly in recent years, and they're getting more and more. Well, the changes are getting more and more exciting if you watch them, and that's also leading to volcanic activity in certain areas. We just saw a tremendous amount of people killed in a earthquake in a different part of the world, so you probably didn't hear about it. But these abrupt changes that happen on a global scale could explain a more widespread problem with a particular species, especially when you're seeing it not just in one area of the United States, but across the entire United States. And what these abrupt changes actually mean, and this is something that I have talked about before on this channel, it would mean complete changes to our growing zones across the world. And that's a very serious thing. If you look at how the world has developed over time, we can't just change where we grow things, right? As people, we've settled and developed. We only have the bread baskets in those areas to really grow a majority of our food. There is a big push to start growing things indoors. There's a big push to get people to start eating bugs, but if the bugs can't survive this stuff, I don't know what eating bugs is gonna do for you. And I've always kind of carried this theory with me because I think the next big major event that we're going to run into is around 2035, and I think by then, if you haven't figured out how to produce your own food, if you haven't figured out how to grow your own food, or you haven't figured out how to get in with farmers and people who are who are knowledgeable of this stuff and planning for it and the way that they're planning their farms and their ranches, then you're going to be out of luck, because there's not going to be a way, if we shift growing zones, if we shift anything with how we produce for 8 billion people, we're not going to be able to just jump back in and produce for 8 billion people. There'll be mass starvation. And we're seeing it in real time. This isn't forecasting stuff that is never going to happen. I said years ago, when I used to talk about this a little more often, that I felt that we would have confirmation in the directions of some of these solar forcings and other changes to our Earth on a cosmic scale by 2025. And I think that in many ways we're getting those confirmations. If you look at the sunspot numbers, they're quickly dropping from solar maximum. And that could lead us into a deeper solar minimum period this time around. And there's no telling what we would be looking at with the next solar cycle. But there are definitely changes happening. We've had weak solar cycles for the last several solar cycles. And solar forcings have a huge impact on the climate of Earth, on our ability to grow food, on our ability to survive. They also have a huge impact on our magnetosphere, which so many of these species depend on for navigation, for timing the seasons, everything. Everything depends on cosmic forcings, not just here on Earth. I think it's honestly, I think it's a bit arrogant for us to assume that we have the ability to change weather, to change something as big as climate, to change Earth, and that we have the ability to fix it. I'm sure we have an impact. Everything has an impact in an ecosystem, right? I'm sure we cause imbalances, but Mother Nature, she is powerful. And when it comes to corrections, the Earth is one thing that will never die. We might go through an extinction level event. There's been over 5, and I am sure there's going to be more. You know, the big concern I think with a lot of people is that we're due for another one, and we're seeing some of these changes occurring that mean much greater things. You know, some people even talk about the possibility of there being a pole shift. As we continue to see polar wander, and as it gets closer to our other pole, you know, have you ever held two magnets together as they get closer and closer? All of a sudden they move really fast towards each other. I would argue that we could be experiencing a time where we're getting close to something like that. I'm not saying this to scare you, but what I'm saying is all this noise that I've heard out there, from YouTube videos to the news to, you know, environmental websites where there's obviously some blame on human beings constantly being put out there. But when I put the data up next to other data, when you look at, okay, when did we see the last increase in die-off in bee populations, and what did that correspond to, and what could it be corresponding to now, even though we don't have, as a public, we don't have all of the data that we need to know. To me, that's where my theory is. That's what I think it is. I think it has to do with magnetic energy and our pole shift. Because otherwise, we would have seen a big bee die off if it was 5G back in 2019, when COVID miraculously spread around the world. We would have seen a steady bee die off, not jumps and changes in population and numbers. We would have just seen a steady increase if it had to do with what we're spraying in the skies. And I'm not denying that happens. I'm just saying, like, to me, there would have been a corresponding evidence to go along with that claim. But something that has changed and held steady kind of through the 90s is the velocity at which our magnetic poles are moving. And again, if that sped up, if something again is changing in that realm, that could explain the sudden jump from the 40s to 50s to the 60s to 70% die-off in our bee population. Think about it. Let me know what you think down below.